Okay. So we have a person joining us. Hello, everyone. Okay. So, hello, everyone, and welcome back to our weekly amazing philosophical talks with S.Friedman. He is an American scientist, philosopher, artist who is going to organize these philosophical weekly talks every Friday at 11 a.m. Almaty time. And very happy to see the newcomers and our guests. So let's please greet our guest and also enjoy the talk. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your talks, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Ali, for the introduction. As usual, I'd like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Almaty for making these talks possible, in particular, Elmira, Tracy, Consul General Eric Meyer, and our new moderator, Aaliyah, who will be guiding us through these talks every week, taking your questions and sending them on to me. We're going to do a little bit different format with questions, at least this week and probably for the weeks coming. Instead of taking the questions that I wasn't able to answer the previous time and address them at the beginning of the session, we're going to be addressing them at the end, simply so that people tuning in for the given topic will be able to encounter that topic and then questions later. So I'll be talking for 60 or 70 minutes. At the end, I'll address the questions from last time, which were excellent, and any new questions that I'll have time for. If there isn't time, again, they'll be addressed at the end of next session. Okay, tonight's topic is What is Life? And the full title is What is Life? A Libretto. I'm going to explain that in a second. First, I wanted to make a couple of general comments. Philosophy is not easy, especially when you're encountering new ideas or ideas that might not be extremely familiar. Yet it takes time to assimilate to them, for those ideas to become intuitive. It's challenging for everyone. It's challenging for me, it's challenging for anyone doing philosophy. It's the nature of the enterprise. But the rewards are enormous. I've mentioned before that I write aphoristically, in concentrated statements. I've written, maybe 20,000 such aphorisms in more than 200 books. Well, I have some aphorisms that address that difficulty. Like, the thought, the philosophy is difficult, the alternative, unbearable. Or we oppose powerful tendencies of mind, and so philosophy is difficult. So it's not intentionally so, and it gets easier with exposure. The moderator from last year's sessions said to me when she looked at last week's summary that if she had read that summary 6 months ago, she wouldn't have understood it, but now she does, having been exposed. So it's simply a matter of encountering the material and encountering it from a variety of different perspectives. And that's what I try to do, with these individual talks, approach things not just from one particular path, but a variety. Okay. And one more recommendation. Because of how difficult philosophy is, because of how demanding it is on our thinking, our processing of information, and again, especially if we're processing new ideas, I recommend Blueberries. Yes, they've done studies of all different age groups, from the very young to the very old, and they find that a handful of blueberries increase cognitive ability, the ability to receive information, to process it, to understand it. Every time before I give a talk, I now have a handful of blueberries. So it's a real effect. I've recommended it to other people, and they find that it works. It's something that I recommend generally. If you're going to take an exam, for example, Blueberries in advance. It might be the single best thing you can do aside from studying. Okay, so I recommend that in advance of these talks too. Anytime you're encountering something that might be intellectually demanding, challenging, Blueberries are a good facilitator of understanding. Okay, the title, What is Life? A Libretto, actually comes from a quotation from André Malraux. I've mentioned André Malraux before. He was a 20th century French intellectual, one of the extraordinary figures of the 20th century, and so of many centuries. He was an art historian, for which he was celebrated. He was a novelist, also celebrated for that. A leader of the French resistance during World War II, an adventurer. He was French Minister of Culture under de Gaulle, and the only person for whom Picasso ever stopped painting when Malraux visited his studio. And I think you know the high regard I hold Picasso in, not just as a painter or a sculptor, not just as an artist, but as an intelligence. If you read random statements by Picasso, many of which are aphoristic, concentrated, you'll see how compelling, his perspective is. So he held Malraux in high regard. I've held Malraux in high regard since college. And in this work of his, Anti-Memoirs, which I recommend strongly, especially for some background and perspective on my philosophical work, part of what motivated it and continues to motivate it, aside from the technical history of philosophy, the interest in elaborating, right, the requirements of rigor, as I'm going to be talking about again briefly. The whole sensibility that we find in Malraux's writings is something that has been compelling to me. Well, Anti-Memoirs deals, as Malraux writes at the beginning, with those questions with which death raises about the meaning of the world. So it's philosophically inspired, even though it's not so much giving answers. It's raising questions. But it does suggest an answer, a type of answer, to the question, what is life? Early in the book. And Malraux's statement is, in the multifarious forms of that which drives us on, in all that I have seen of man's struggle against humiliation, and even in that sweetness which one can scarcely believe exists on this earth, life, like the gods of vanished religions, appears to me at times as if it were the libretto for some unknown music. Now that's as elevated and poetic, an expression of a response to the question, what is life, as one's going to find. There are a few things to note about it, and I want to comment on this briefly. This mode of commenting, by the way, is one way of doing philosophy. The philosopher Stanley Cavell, 20th century philosopher, he was prominent at Harvard, did philosophy almost entirely this way. He would take a text and he would go through passages and analyze them, discuss them, comment upon them, in whatever appropriate, detail he felt was necessary to achieve understanding and insight. Well, few things about that statement by Malraux. First of all, he talks about the multifarious forms of that which drives us on. Now, multifarious is just a word that means many, okay? The many things, and notice that gives us a broad sense, a broad sweep of human life, human activity. It's something that we find in a poet like Walt Whitman, one of the great American poets, probably along with Emily Dickinson, the greatest of American poets. Walt Whitman often wrote of strings of things. He was trying to achieve a complete sort of description and response to the totality of things, okay? Which is close to the philosophic enterprise, right? Philosophy wants to understand everything, right? Solve everything, if, such a result is possible. Well, so that's the beginning of this. Malraux sort of states, that he's going to try to respond to the sweep of human experience with some response. Then he talks about in all of man's struggle against humiliation, right? The pain, the anguish, the horror. I've talked in the past about how religions typically begin with a sense of the unsatisfactoriness of life, the profound unsatisfactoriness. For Buddhism, for Siddhartha Gautama, it was the encounter with disease, old age, and death that led to his demanding of himself that he find a solution right there, right then. Okay? In the case of when Buddhists encountered Christians for the first time, historically, they were astonished that these were individuals with crosses around their necks, that they worshipped a man being tortured. Well, again, to be taken seriously, a religion has to address the worst, has to have a response for the worst. Torture to death, is among the worst, if not the worst, of possible human fates. So we need a response to that. It's one thing to be able to help people deal with a headache. It's quite another to deal with that extremity. Okay? So Malraux is attentive to that. On the other hand, talks about that sweetness, that one can scarcely believe exists on this earth. So there's a range, right? A range from that life encompasses, that we are interested in response to. A range from the worst, the intolerable, the horrific, to the sublime, the ecstatic, right? Now, I should say, there are two fundamental responses to that range of life experiences in terms of a solution. One is to consider, it's going to be a personal judgment, the degree to which the sublime, the good, the desirable, the beautiful, the wonderful, the ecstatic just overwhelms the horror. So that even if one has to have both, the one justifies the other, okay? So it's not as if one is trying to avoid or eliminate the horror, just the ecstatic or the sublime effectively overwhelms it in our ultimate evaluation of the experience. And so life becomes justified because of those ecstatic or sublime aspects. The other is, and this is more in tune with religious responses and philosophical responses, is to somehow undermine our sense of the horrific so that it doesn't have the force, the power, the overwhelming weight, to oppress us that we might think. So that, for example, is the enterprise of Buddhism, right? To find a solution to disease, old age, and death by ending disease, old age, and death. And doing it, as I mentioned before, and as I'm sure we'll refer to again and revisit in terms of the analysis, by ending the concepts. Ending concepts of these things is central to a lot of these responses. It's central to the philosophic response to not only questions of the nature of life, but all the pressing issues that people raise. And let me just comment on that briefly. There are two ways, fundamentally, to end concepts. One is by considering what I went into in some greater detail last time, epistemic and heuristic spaces. These are terms, they're a little bit technical. An epistemic space is just philosophy. And philosophy is just everything that we could know without a shadow of a doubt. Everything that we could know incontrovertibly. Everything that is rigorous at its limit. Now, I got a question last time asking for some synonyms for rigor and rigorous. Let me give you a few of those now. Some I've already just stated. The incontestable, what cannot possibly be doubted. The incontrovertible, another term for what cannot possibly be doubted. What is certain, certain beyond all possibility of doubt. That's what rigor and the rigorous amounts to. No possibility of doubting. Now, the kind of things you can know, a couple of propositions that fall into that category. Past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, which I've talked about in the past, and I will talk about in the future. Another type of proposition, well, one thing to note about those propositions is that they tend to be about the nature of our concepts, not about the world, though the world does, our concepts reflect the world, but those things are incontrovertible because of the nature of the past and the nature of the future, that the future has not yet happened. And so in principle, it can take any possible form so far as we can know, okay? So that's how that type of proposition works. But some other things about the epistemic. It's a space, and I think you might remember from last time I gave the mathematical formulation of it. A is not equal to A. In an epistemic space, imagine just looking all around you and imagine just everything made up of points, individual points, okay? Like a mathematical space. In an epistemic space, everything you see, every point you observe, every object you see is fundamentally distinct from every other object. So you can't group things together based upon similarities. That happens in the other kind of space, a heuristic space. So in an epistemic space, there are no concepts. Now, if that sounds a little bit bizarre, well, there are also no concepts in Buddhist nirvana. There are no concepts in mystical union with God. And that represents the other way in which concepts can disappear. Concepts cluster things together for certain purposes. Like balls represent things that have certain properties in common. But in an epistemic space, everything is radically distinct, rigorously distinct, and is not clustered. No concepts are formulatable, okay? The opposite type of space is heuristic, where we group things together for various purposes. Those purposes give rise to concepts, things that are similar for one reason or another. I think I've given the aphorism before. Any two things are approximately the same in heuristic space, rigorously different in epistemic space. The reality is epistemic. The heuristic is an approximation to reality. And the logic of the epistemic is divergence. Things are separate and distinct. the logic of the heuristic is convergence. We bring things together. Now, it turns out everything that you're familiar with is heuristic because it's what constitutes objects. Like, objects represent clusters of things, clusters of sensations, of past experience, of future expectation. So they are things that are brought together. They represent convergences. Every mode of human creativity is a matter of bringing things together. Every mode of analysis brings things together of some form or other. Our experience, moment to moment, new things are converging upon us. That represents the nature of time. Time is sequential convergence, is a way to say it, okay? Well, anytime we're talking about bringing things together, we're talking about something that's heuristic. We're talking about something that's not rigorous. We're talking about something that can be helpful to us, that can help us. We can make inventions. If we invent a telescope, we're putting different components together. If we make a car, we're assembling components. If we make a computer, we're assembling components. We make an artwork, we're assembling components. If we create a human being, we're bringing things together, okay? That's the nature of the normal experience of life in society. That's the nature of technology. That's the nature of science. These things help us survive. And they help us survive partly because they make us aware of similarities between things that can hurt us. You know, that we see a hot stove, we learn not to touch it. We learn that anything resembling a hot stove should be avoided. That's how we survive. Salvation, the kind of thing that religions have sought in terms of a complete solution right here, right now, where all the problems disappear, all the concepts evaporate. You know, you are one with God, or you're in a state of salvation, or you've achieved Buddhist enlightenment or nirvana. That is a state of philosophical rigor. I have an aphorism for that. Eden is a landscape of philosophical rigor. And if you want to know where that is, it's everywhere around you. But the hallmark of that, the identifying characteristics are, it is strange, and it is beautiful, and it is new. And you're not seeing the strangeness and the novelty because you're seeing your convergent structures, the objects that your mind sort of assembles, or the language facilitates our seeing things clustered in certain ways. And again, that's what facilitates our survival. Our salvation works in the opposite direction. Okay, back to the libretto concept. So Malraux continues, life, like the gods of vanished religions. Now he's introducing, well, it's a simile, but a metaphor, right? He's invoking life and the stories of the gods, right? And he goes right into a libretto for some unknown music. What's a libretto? A libretto is the text, the words to an opera, typically, mostly an opera. Talks about a libretto to some unknown music. So he's using the metaphor of an opera. Now, an opera is often seen as, well, at least a candidate for the grandest of all forms of art. The only thing that can really compete with it would be a movie, like an epic film. But for most of the last few hundred years, opera was considered the highest art form. And it certainly has been served by some of the greatest creative talents in human history. Like Shakespeare, well, Mozart, considered often the Shakespeare of opera, was at his greatest. In his greatest operas, Mozart's great operas represent as great a human achievement as there is. So Malraux was attuned to opera. He actually had commissioned the French painter Chagall to paint the ceiling of the Paris Opera House when he was French Minister of Culture, which was, I think, done around the time that he was writing Anti-Memoirs. So in any case, what Malraux is doing is bringing ideas together, right? That's what we do creatively. That's what we do when we are writing a poem, right? Poems use a lot of metaphors. They link things together that are not typically thought of as associated. Life, libretto, life, the gods. That type of enterprise, bringing things together, is a convergent process. And a convergent process is what operates within heuristic space. It helps us in some way. It might entertain us. It might, typically in the sciences in particular, lead to discoveries, in the sense that now that we're thinking in terms of life being a possible libretto to some unknown music, well, maybe you want to try to find that music or seek that music. And that becomes like a motivation, to an enterprise that might help us in some way that we're not yet sure of because we don't have that music in hand. Anything that's heuristic is based on convergence, but it's not rigorous. That means it can help us, it cannot save us. And it's not incontrovertible. In other words, there are always other possibilities. But it's something that we might want to, again, work with just because it's entertaining or enriching, or it might suggest, we might read that comment by Malraux and end up writing a poem about it, or end up doing a film about it. We might be inspired by it. That's the kind of thing that heuristics achieve. Now, that's a poetic form of convergence, right? The more prominent, I think, in our culture, type of heuristic is science. Science is heuristic, not epistemic. It helps us survive. It's not incontrovertible. We are not forced to accept its propositions. Again, I've dealt with some of these issues before, but simply because it is theoretically impossible to perform a controlled experiment. And controlled experiments are at the core of science. So scientific results have to earn their way by helping us in some way. They have to help us, if we're doing physics, build bridges, better bridges. They have to lead to engineering that can allow us to construct skyscrapers that don't collapse. If our physics can't serve us in those ways, we will seek a new physics. Okay? In a similar way, molecular biology is motivated partly by the interest in ending surgery. Surgery is kind of a barbaric way of going about curing people, of issues, making incisions. It's traumatic to the body. Surgery is difficult. The recovery from surgery is always demanding on the body. So it would be nice if we could have some sort of magic wand, a pill, for whatever the condition was that would stimulate repair and guide repair to its successful completion. So we no longer needed surgery. Well, molecular biology obviously is part of biology. And biology is the study of life. Bio means life, ology, study. So one way to address the question of what is life is through science, through biology. But notice, it's heuristic, not technically philosophic, not rigorous. So it's going to give us suggestions of solutions that might be helpful in some way or other, but not rigorous, not incontrovertible, something that we can use, but that we are not used by necessarily, okay? It's our choice. Well, what's the molecular biological view of life? Here's an interesting, something that kind of just came to my mind. When I was in medical school, we had a course on physiology. That's the study of basically the systems of the body. Circulatory system, how it works, on the respiratory system, how it functions, all different body, the nervous system. Okay. What was interesting is that even though physiology was fundamental to biology and to medicine, there were no good textbooks on physiology. Right? Our professors didn't exactly know what to assign, so we ended up mostly relying upon their notes, or they would assign like a chapter here from one book and some pages here from another book, but it wasn't anything that they felt was appropriate for us to be able to embrace. In a way, there were such books, such standard texts, such accomplished and comprehensive texts for other branches of medicine and medical education, like anatomy or biochemistry or histology or pathology. So it wasn't something that I was always that happy with, because I wasn't happy with the presentation of physiology. Well, a few years ago, I had to help somebody. I got a request to help somebody with a physiology course. So I went online and I looked up current physiology books. And what I found was they were completely transformed. And the physiology was now almost entirely in terms of molecules and chemistry and basically molecular biology. So molecular biology has become central to the whole enterprise of biology. And there's good reason for that. And that is that molecular biology allows us to manipulate systems at their most fundamental level, to manipulate living systems at the level of their most fundamental components. So it gives us the most power, in principle, over those systems, and in principle, the greatest hope for cures to disease. Ultimately, it'll be molecular biology that achieves definitive solutions to the kind of issues that Siddhartha Gautama was seeking solutions to, but didn't have the molecular biological apparatus to help him. Well, from a molecular biological standpoint, living things are defined by complexity. The non-living is made up of relatively simple structures, simple molecules. And you add like the world around us, the physical world that we see is made up of atoms of different types. There are elements like gold, silver. Each one has a characteristic atom, sort of a fundamental component of that substance, and atoms can link together to form molecules. Well, the molecules that make up, the air, or that make up paint, or that make up most of the products around us, the things that are not living, are relatively simple. Or if they're more complicated, it's because they're derived from living things, like things made of wood. Okay, then their complexity is because they were ultimately derived from something that was living, but they don't have the full complexity of a living thing because now they're inert. Right? They're not as complex. So, from a molecular biological standpoint, you bring together lots of elements in highly ordered fashion, and you achieve basically the complexity of a living thing. From the standpoint of the sciences, the only fundamental distinction between the living and the non-living is orders of complexity. The biological molecules that you've heard about from like nutrition science, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, nucleic acids like DNA, RNA. You hear that the coronavirus is an RNA virus. Nucleic acids, genetic material that gives the blueprint for individuals. These are extremely complex molecules. The non-living environment doesn't have anything at that level of complexity. And it's that complexity that gives it the ability to function and respond and interact with the world and carry out all types of activities characteristic, as we see characteristic, of living things. Okay? So it's not a fundamental, what we might call qualitative distinction between living and non-living. It's a matter of degree and degree of complexity that makes the difference. In general, the more things we bring together, the more complex, as long as the things that we're bringing together are ordered in some way. They're not randomly brought together. And that is characteristic of the structures of our cells, the structures of the components of our cells. They are highly, highly ordered systems. Now, one of the things, again, speaking in a context of physics and science, one of the things about highly ordered systems is it's hard to maintain that order. There's a tendency, called entropy, for things to go to disorder, simply because it's more probable that things end up in a disordered state than in an ordered state. If I throw up a deck of cards, the chances are those cards are going to land randomly on the floor, because there are more ways that those cards can land randomly than completely in a neat pile, where they're all organized according to, suite and, number and, rank of card, okay? To maintain order takes effort, takes energy. Your apartment, your home, your environment will, over time, become a mess if you don't put energy in to clean it up, right? To order it. The demand that we have as highly complex systems to maintain order requires a constant input of energy. That's why we have to eat. So energy in is necessary to maintain a highly ordered system that a living organism is. Now, here's another sort of physical analogy. There are two kinds of systems that are prominent for us to discuss in terms of systems that can maintain their order. And I'm going to illustrate them with a bathtub. Imagine filling up a bathtub with water, and the drain is closed, right? And you fill up the bathtub and then turn off the faucet, okay? And then you close the bathroom. So air isn't going to be moving in and out, okay? What's going to happen is some water from the bath is going to evaporate, and the air in the room will get humid. It'll feel kind of sticky or moist up to a certain point, and then it'll stop evaporating, and that level of moisture in the air will be constant, okay? And the bathtub level will be constant over time, okay? That's called an equilibrium situation, okay? Where we have a system that's basically walled off from the outside world. We've kind of closed the door, we've closed the window, we've sealed the bathroom off, so it's a little sort of self-contained environment, okay? In a self-contained environment like that, what we call a closed system, that bathtub will achieve equilibrium, okay? Now, where basically there's things happening. If we could look under the right type of microscope, we could see that atoms and molecules from the water were evaporating, going up into the air, and ones from the air were going back into the water. And that was a constant back and forth process. So it's an active system. We call it a dynamic system, okay? But equilibrium, okay? It stays the same. Now, living things tend to like to maintain their internal environment the same. We call that homeostasis. Living things actually are adapted to relatively narrow conditions, environmental conditions. We can't do well on Mars, not without all kinds of protections and measures. We can't do well in outer space. Okay, we actually are adapted to a temperature range, most living things, between 20 and 40 degrees Celsius. We're adapted to atmospheric pressure, the type of pressure that exists around sea level. As we get like a mile high or so, it gets more difficult. 2 miles high, 3 miles high, very difficult. Okay, we're adapted to the concentration of oxygen, around sea level. We're adapted to pH, that's kind of neutral. So we have these relatively narrow sort of ranges of conditions that we can flourish in. Okay? And one of the main things that the body is trying to do is, as the environment around us changes, it's trying to maintain a constant inner environment. All those complex molecules that I mentioned, like the proteins, the fats, the nucleic acids, all of those molecules tend to require very narrow ranges, of temperature, of all those conditions to function properly in it. So the body is trying to maintain its inner environment constant, okay? A lot of what we are as human beings, as animals, or as living things in general, is designed so that in changing environmental conditions, we can nevertheless maintain a constant and optimal, a desirable internal environment inside us. Okay? Well, the other situation in the bathroom is one where the faucet is on, the drain is open. Okay? The bathroom can be closed, but you have water flowing in to the tub, you have water leaving the tub, but the rate at which the water enters equals the rate at which it leaves. And the water level of the bath remains the same. Okay? Now, notice, as in the other situation where the faucet was closed and the drain was closed, water level stays the same. But it's a fundamentally different situation because things are flowing in and things are flowing out. That's called a steady state situation, okay? That's also a situation that can maintain a constant internal environment. But it's one where there's change happening, things are moving in, things are moving out. That is the condition of living things. We are steady state systems where we're taking things in, we're taking in oxygen, we're taking in food, we're taking in energy in that form, we're taking water, we're taking in all different kinds of things, and we're releasing things constantly, right? Into the air, we sweat, so we are steady state systems where things are changing around us, things are coming in, things are going out, but we are maintaining a constant internal state. That is the condition of complex organisms. That's the condition of living things generally. Steady state systems, okay? systems that are maintaining their complexity because they're taking in energy. That's essential to maintain complexity in the same way as you need energy to maintain an ordered room, an ordered environment, an ordered garden, okay? You need to garden if you want everything not to become completely wild, right? And out of control, okay? Well, we are steady state systems as living organisms. When we die, if we die, we become equilibrium systems. At that point, things are not to a degree, to the degree previously, entering us, leaving us at the kind of rates necessary to sustain us. So life is a steady state system where things are moving in, things are moving out, but we're maintaining a relative internal constancy and maintaining a high order of complexity. Equilibrium is death. And obviously, once we do die, since we're not taking in energy in a steady state situation, the complexity begins to break down. Our cells, our molecules, our components break down. To maintain complexity, you need energy, okay? So that gives us like the scientific perspective, right, on what is life. But let's get a little bit more philosophic. We're dealing with a question, right, about a concept, life, okay? One line of inquiry here that has some practical applications is, well, how do we know that something is alive? Or when do we call something like living? And I'm thinking now in terms of some social issues, social controversies like abortion, like where, like, at what point does something become living? Like when a sperm and an egg fertilize and create a fertilized egg, a zygote. That's the moment of conception. Is that living? Is that living and human? What about when it becomes, like 8 cells or dozens of cells? Is that when it becomes an embryo? Is that living? Is that human? What about a fetus? Living, human? At what point does something transition from not living to living? And again, it applies to other concepts too. At what point does something transition from non-human to human? Okay? Same kind of considerations are going to be operating. So we're talking now about the meaning of a word, right? The meaning of a word like living, like life. And I want to make a few comments about how words mean, because one of the things that philosophy has done is clarify some of these issues. There's a view that the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. So, for example, the meaning of dog is, well, those dogs, okay? And if I am going to teach somebody, I teach a child what a dog is, I'm going to point to dogs, right? That's a dog, that's a dog, that's a dog, okay? The object defines the use of the word, right? In general, we talk about defining words, defining words like dog, but one thing to keep in mind is we don't tend to learn those words by definition, right? We certainly have to have learned words of a fairly substantial vocabulary before we can begin to even understand definitions, okay? And it turns out when we have a focus on definition, that's really very late in the language acquisition process. And typically definitions are even more prominent when we're learning a second language, and we already basically know the nature, of language, the nature of concepts, and we're just basically translating from one language to another. Okay? So definition in words is not really fundamental to the early learning of language. But some people do think that definition by pointing to the object is. We call that ostensive definition. Okay? And it's something that I've referred to before in some past talks. Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher that was the most important influence upon my work, began his most important work, the Philosophical Investigations, with a quotation from St. Augustine, in which St. Augustine, in his Confessions, which is an autobiographical work by the great Christian theologian, St. Augustine from the 4th century AD, talks about the learning of language. And he gives the basic common sense idea that, as a child, you look around and adults point to something, or you point to something, and the adult says, that's book or chair or table, whatever it is, and we learn to associate the sound with the object. Okay. Again, that's sort of seeing words as labels for things. And in fact, when we learn a second language, we often, people often go around their environment and label things with the word, from the language they're trying to learn. It facilitates that kind of learning. Well, again, that concept of a word as a label is something that applies in the learning of the second language. And it misleads us in understanding how words fundamentally work. One of the issues historically in philosophy with this notion that the meaning of a word is the object for which the word stands. The meaning of dog is that dog, okay? Is that it raises the question, if the object doesn't exist or has ceased to exist or never existed, what meaning exactly does the word have? How does unicorn, which doesn't exist as an entity, mean if the meaning of a word is the object for which it stands and there is no such thing as a unicorn? Well, people have responded to that kind of issue by saying, well, the concept exists. Plato, actually, as great a philosopher as we can discuss, wrote about Platonic forms, where basically concepts existed in an abstract state, and the concept, in a sense, the concept dog, the concept chair, the concept table was more real than the actual dog or table or chair. And the dog, table, or chair that we see in our environment is really a kind of an imperfect embodiment of this ideal notion of dog. Okay? And that kind of connects to this other sort of misunderstanding about language and the meaning of words, that if we call things dogs, it's because they have the essence, they share the essence of what it is to be a dog. Because we, again, think in terms of essence as that essential characteristic or set of characteristics that makes that thing, and it's that set of essentialness that the definition is trying to capture. Well, again, these are common notions, and they're fundamentally wrong. And the fact that they are common actually misleads a lot of our everyday thinking about lots of things. And understanding how they're wrong helps clarify lots of things, including when something is alive. Okay? Well, I'm going to give, I think, a little example here to show you exactly how words do mean. We're going to imagine a primitive society, okay? We're going to imagine a society with two people, or a society where there's only one form of social interaction between people, okay? The society is going to consist of the process of acquiring stones and bricks, or forming stones and bricks. One person is responsible for that, okay? And another person is responsible for assembling stones and bricks into structures like little homes, okay? Dwellings. The language of this society is going to facilitate their work together, okay? And basically, all we're going to have are the words brick and stone. And when the person who is building the structure needs a stone, he will say to the person some distance away who's at the quarry, stone. And that means bring me one stone. If he needs 2 stones, he'll say stone, stone. Bring me 2 stones. 3 stones, stone, stone, stone. Or brick, brick. Or maybe brick, brick, stone. Bring me 2 bricks and 1 stone. That's the language. That's the society. Okay? That language is facilitating the work of those people in constructing, little protective enclosures, right? Okay. In such a situation, given such a primitive language that kind of distills, what's going on in the language, a language where the complexity of our current language makes it hard to discern really what is going on, we ask the question, what's the meaning of a brick? Well, it's obvious. The meaning of brick is the activity, bring me the brick. It's not the object for which the word stands, it relates to the activity, the use of that word in that little culture, that society. Now, that becomes a fundamental sort of revelation, that the meaning of a word ultimately, and this applies broadly, we don't have time to go into all of the applications of it, but just to introduce the idea. The meaning of a word is not the object for which the word stands, but the use of that word in that culture facilitating the form of life of that society. And language exists to facilitate social forms of life, of coordination, of activity. It does not exist to communicate thoughts. We can end up doing that, but ultimately, fundamentally, there is survival value in a society. And what facilitates that society is cooperativity among its members. And language is the most powerful instrument for facilitating that cooperativity. Now, to see, and to deal with that question, how does a word have meaning if the object that the word refers to no longer exists, ceases to exist? We can look at this situation here, and it can show us where meaning comes from. Let's say that the person that's preparing the stones and the bricks runs out of bricks, okay? And let's say the person who's building the home shouts out, brick. What's the person who's supposed to deliver the brick to do? Doesn't know what to do. We don't have a word for it. We don't have, there's no linguistic device for that situation. In that situation, that word has no meaning. That's a situation where in the absence of the object, the word ceases to mean. There's nothing we can do with that. But if we introduce another word, let's say none, okay, where if you run out of bricks or run out of stones and you say brick, the other person says none, suddenly we have a communication, and suddenly that word brick, in the absence of any bricks to deliver, has meaning in the sense that it still has use. It can elicit a response, okay? That's one aspect of words, of language, that helps us clarify lots of issues, as I I'm going to try to see. Okay, another issue, another question to address. When we use a concept, I mentioned earlier, we think in terms of things like dogs having a certain essence that governs the use of that word, as if we could look inside the dog and see the essence of dog, and that's why that word applies. Well, we have a tendency to think that, again, all the objects that we refer to with a certain term, like dog, have something or some set of things in common. Okay? Well, a common example to look at is maybe the example of a ball. Right? A ball is a round object, right? Typically spherical, used in games. Okay? But what about a football? Football is not round, it's kind of ellipsoid, it's kind of pointy at the ends. Okay? We think, well, okay, but it's close to, but but certainly all balls are used in games. Well, what about like a ball and chain, right? That's used to keep a prisoner, from fleeing, okay? That's not used in a game, right? It's used in something deadly serious. The point is, the application, the use of a word is not governed by an essence that each object to which we apply that term contains. The use of a word is governed by what Wittgenstein called family resemblances. There's similarities, enough similarities and between a football and a baseball or a soccer ball or a tennis ball, and we'll call them both balls. But these things are not determined by an inner essence that we need to peer into. This is a mistake that's based on this common mistake that we make of thinking that we can see the world from outside the world, that we can see the world as if we were a novelist, seeing in and through everything from a third-person perspective, from the perspective of God. Okay, this is not true. Okay. So it turns out that we use a word like ball based upon similarities to other things that we call balls, not because of a set of fixed properties that all balls share, but there are similarities and differences. If the similarities are enough, we'll call it a ball, but we're not being forced. And it's not something that we can look in and intuit. It's a matter of degree of similarity, and there's an arbitrariness to it. Okay? There's an arbitrariness to our use of any given concept because it's not based upon the detection of an essence that demands the use of that concept. Well, the same thing applies when it's a matter of deciding, is a cell that's been fertilized alive? Is it human? At what point does it become human? Does it become alive? There's no point at which to definitively assign life, living versus non-living in those contexts. It's a matter of degree, of similarity or difference. So you can make a stipulation, you can say at conception or at birth, or at 9 weeks, or at 12 weeks, but it's fundamentally arbitrary because concepts don't have sharp boundaries, is what this amounts to. Concepts are, if they have a sharp boundary, it's because we have arbitrarily and for some purpose given it a boundary, a sharp boundary. That's what happens, for example, when we create a game, invent a game. Now, if we were sitting down to invent chess, we would stipulate what the moves were, for a given piece. We would define a piece in terms of its moves, and that's it. We've given it those definitions, but that's something we're doing ourselves. When it comes to like the use of words like life and what they apply to, well, it's not, again, there's no sharp boundary inherent in the use of a word. It's a matter of degree of similarity or difference, and there's an arbitrariness. So it's, again, you can go into a court and stipulate, or a legislature can stipulate at a certain age this becomes alive, or under certain sets of conditions, but it's arbitrary. It's not in the nature of the concept. That's not how concepts function. Okay? Now, there's one more topic. Oh, okay. There was one more topic I wanted to deal with. I want to get to the question, so let me I'll deal with it at some other point, but it's the nature of propositions like a rose is a rose, a man is a man, life is life, okay? Where you're saying something that doesn't sound like it's saying anything, right? A rose is a rose. Well, yes, of course. But it's not communicating. We call that in logic, in philosophy, a tautology. And tautologies like a rose is a rose seem, they're not saying anything about the world. They're not saying anything about roses, okay? But at the same time that they're seemingly not saying anything of any real consequence, they're often used to express the deepest insights into our circumstance or our condition. Something like life is life, or a man is a man. That actually is the upshot of Shakespeare's greatest play, King Lear. He thinks he's a king. He thinks he's imperial. He's above and beyond everybody else. He has to discover that he is a man. Okay, and the question is, a proposition like life is life. How does that mean? How does that communicate? And without going into all the details, because I want to get to the questions, let me just say, if you slow it down and say, a man is, life is, you're expecting to hear something like, a man is tall, or strong, or a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there, some set of adjectives, okay? That's your expectation, okay? Language often communicates to our expectations. Well, when we hear a man is, we're expecting some description, some characterization. To hear a man is a denial of that expectation. It means by that denial of what we're expecting. And that actually turns out to be how humor works. When we're listening to a joke, we are given a setup. There's a beginning to the joke that has us thinking in a certain direction. The joke punchline takes us in a totally different direction. That sense of laughter is a sense of liberation. And it's a sense of liberation from the prison of expectation. And that's one of the things, fundamentally, that philosophy is aiming to free us from, those expectations, even as to things like life. So one final characterization is related to some other issues I've stressed in the past, which is the future decides the past. So there's another sense in which we don't yet know, because what comes next can be decisive and can change everything. Okay, so I didn't get to talk about everything I wanted to develop, as is typical, but I think this is a reasonable point to stop so I can address some of the questions from last time. Now, I've already addressed one of those questions, which was, can you give some synonyms for rigor, right? And again, philosophy is rigor. So philosophy is a synonym, but and epistemic is a synonym, but that's not too helpful. But incontrovertible, certain, beyond any doubt, any possible doubt, incontestable, something that cannot possibly be denied. And a good simple example is rigorously, we do not know, each one of us, that we will die, okay? We often hear that death is certain. It's not rigorously certain. And it's not rigorously certain because of any one thing that distinguishes us from every other object, every other living thing, every other thing, person, who or that has ever lived. And simply the fact that I'm here and all of those other individuals, are in different places. That is enough of a difference. That means rigorously what has applied to anyone else, now or in the past, need not rigorously apply to you or to me. That includes death, and that includes all concepts. Now, that's part of the nature of rigor. And again, rigor at its extreme is strange. It presents a strange kind of landscape, but that strangeness, again, is the landscape of Eden, and that's the landscape of what religions have aspired to, where the concepts fall by the wayside. And by the way, concepts fall by the wayside too in traditions that embrace the concept of a God, because a God is a universal convergence. All things become one thing. And when all things become one thing, all distinctions vanish and the concepts cease to apply. It would be as if all the tones in this room of all the objects became exactly the same. So you couldn't see any distinction between any objects. They all became one. We wouldn't have any terms to use. Okay, so rigor, incontrovertible, incontestable, certain beyond any possible doubt. It's also all that philosophy is and everything that philosophy is. Okay, so that was one question. Okay, I think there was a question about life during the pandemic, about like mental, emotional, cognitive health. First of all, one cannot generalize. The key thing about philosophy is it's concerned about the specificity of things, right? Any two things are approximately the same, but rigorously different. And so everyone's circumstances are different, and that has to be appreciated and honored always. Right? We have a tendency to want to generalize from our experience, and that's admirable when we're generalizing and being compassionate. But in many other situations, we're generalizing prematurely and inappropriately. We're not in a position to know. So there's a famous line from Shakespeare. I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself king of infinite space. Point is that these conditions, are challenging, but one of the key things about intelligence and human beings are intelligent just as a species, right? Our intelligence manifests itself in adaptability. That's what intelligence is. So in a situation like this, we need to adapt, right? We need to respond. Environmental conditions are always changing. This pandemic has imposed changing environmental conditions on us. We've been confined. Well, we need to make sure that we are stimulating ourselves cognitively, right? We need to be reading. There's no better mental exercise than reading. And reading hard things is better than reading easy things. Reading Shakespeare, is as valuable as reading anybody. Or, each language, has its difficult authors that challenge us in many ways and merit reading at any time, especially now when we have time. Read, if we know Russian, we read Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Turgenev or Pushkin. Okay, reading poetry. There are ways to stimulate ourselves, but yes, we do need stimulation. Now, we often feel constrained by like a pattern. Things are the same repeatedly. And we don't sort of see enough variation. Well, one of the responses to that is to pay closer attention, to what's going on around us. Things are only the same approximately. Okay, in detail, they're changing. If we were, there's the 19th century Impressionist painter Monet painted series of objects, like haystacks, at different times of the day. Each one a masterpiece, each one different, because of changing conditions. There was a time when, again, Wittgenstein, that philosopher I like to refer to, had a friend, a student, who was at the beginning of World War II in the Navy. And the student wrote Wittgenstein saying how boring it was. And war is often considered boring, right? It has certain analogies to this situation. It's kind of a war against a virus. During World War II, lives were confined. They had blackout curtains. Sometimes, obviously, there were people that were imprisoned or in concentration camps. But the point is that we are, so Wittgenstein told this student of his, I understand you're thinking that war is a boredom, but it wouldn't be so boring if you paid more attention and learned from what you can learn. And there's always a lot to learn. There are plenty of stories, legends. There's that relate to the circumstance. There's the legend of the disciple who stares at a blue spot on the wall for decades until he sees enlightenment. He sees Krishna in that spot. Okay? So you can be focused and extract all possible meaning. I mean, think of what we are. Think of what each individual is. Each individual is the sum of the entire previous history of the universe at this point. The entire previous history of the world is summarized in where you are right now. Okay? And remember, from the standpoint of Einstein, each point is the center, the still center of existence. And from the standpoint of modern physics, the Big Bang, the event that created the universe, occurred everywhere, at every point. Okay? So every point is the center, and every point is a point of origin, and every point summarizes the entire history of the universe up to that point. Okay? So, for example, if you need to study life, you can study it by considering yourself. If you need to study energy, you represent that too. Matter, you represent that too. Consciousness, you represent that too. You represent, effectively, a distillation of everything, or convergence of everything, which is why the Delphagorical, at the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition in Greece, admonished, know thyself. And that's essential, for the philosophical enterprise. And there's something else to keep in mind in this pandemic. It's something that Eric Hoffer, a 1960s mostly American philosopher from San Francisco, he commented a lot, he wrote a lot on the political sort of movements of the time, like student movement. But he wrote a book at the end of his life called Before the Sabbath that I'm especially fond of. And in that book, Eric Hoffer comments, he was about 75 at the time he wrote this. He said, "My reconciliation to life as it is stems in no small measure from the fact that in my lifetime, men far more deserving and gifted than myself died like rats in trenches, in German concentration camps, in Soviet labor camps." So that's perspective too, right? Plus, we have extraordinary technology that can, facilitate, our, being in contact with people. And keep in mind too, that during pandemics, during plagues, which were, constant, throughout much of the history of like Western Europe, the world, Newton, during a plague, discovered basically his fundamental principles of calculus and gravitation. Shakespeare wrote King Lear, probably his greatest single play. during the pandemic in London. So there's that aspect as well. But it's a matter of, it's our responsibility, ultimately, okay? But it's a matter of paying attention. It's a matter of using the resources that are available. It's a matter of taking advantage of opportunities that present themselves because other opportunities do not. And it's a matter of keeping perspective, okay? And keeping in mind the uniqueness of each moment. So you want to be paying attention to that novelty. You need to be seeking it out. Okay, there was that question. Now let me see. Then, okay, I think there was a question. There was one question that relates to some things I've talked about a number of times about does the present gives the future. God, I wish I don't have it right in front of me. I might have to return to that. I'm sorry. Okay, let me go down to another one. Why are we here? There's a good question. Is this real? Okay. A couple of things about that. First of all, to investigate a question like that, why are we here? One thing that philosophy sort of prescribes is consider first situations where you might use that. Just not use it in some broad or vague philosophical sense, but use it concretely. Why are we here? Or why are we here? Well, and first of all, my preference would be, why am I here? Not why are we here? Because we might be here for different reasons, right? You don't want to be presumptive about that. Why are we here could be going to a meeting, right? We all sit down, but the purpose of the meeting hasn't been announced. So you might say, why are we here? There, that's a concrete use for that, right? Our philosophic uses ultimately are grounded in some common use and can, by referring to that more common use, we can orient, okay, and get some, well, convergent. We're doing a convergence, right? We're linking some things together to give some perspective on this. Well, so obviously, when we do that, we see that it's asking for a sense of purpose, right? Now, one answer to that question, why are we here, is actually what I said a moment ago in terms of we represent the culmination at this point of the entire history of the universe. That's one thing to keep in mind, okay? And again, each point is different, right? Each individual occupies a different point, and so each individual is summarizing that entire history at a different point, okay? Now, so that's one thing to keep in mind about that. Another thing to keep in mind is that notion of purpose. Why are we here in terms of what's the point of the meeting? Well, you can ask, one of the things that question is asking is, what is our mission? What is our purpose? What are we supposed to be doing here, right? Like for me, my purpose is philosophy. It's my mission, okay? So that global question doesn't come up in the sense that I'm here to do philosophy, okay? So particular mission, but notice again, it's a matter of a particular response, okay, to a particular person's circumstance. Be careful always about generalizing, because any generalization is not going to be rigorous, because it's going to leave out particularities of each individual circumstance, okay? Another aspect of that, and that relates to the question of real, I've addressed in the past this question of, is this life real or a dream, right? That's usually considered the contrast, life versus dream. And if it were a dream, then it's fundamentally not real. And I say, well, if tomorrow or the next day, we wake up to a totally different reality that nevertheless persists, doesn't kind of evaporate, at some point, it's just a completely fundamentally different world, as if we're entering into a new world. Then we look back at this and we decide this was dream. This had been dream. Reality is a term of comparison, as most things are. Okay? So now the question is, do we exist? Well, you can say, so far as we know, depending upon what comes next, or after that, or at the end of time, the reality hasn't necessarily existed, hasn't necessarily begun. But the point is that, again, this goes back to two fundamental propositions that are part of the incontrovertible sort of set of epistemic results. Past cannot guarantee the future, cannot guarantee that this circumstance will persist into tomorrow, and the future decides the past, in the sense that what does happen next or at the end of time is retroactive and can change our complete sense of what we've been involved with. Okay, to radical degrees. There was I was once in a conversation with a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, and we were talking about the nature of human suffering and pain and the philosophic response to it. And philosophy does have responses that the Jewish tradition doesn't, but not of that character. And so the rabbi at one point asked me about what about the Holocaust, that horrific, amount of suffering. And I wrote about this actually in that play, Phalaris' Bull. I thought to myself, well, what I want to say is going to get me thrown out of this office as a Holocaust denier. But I said anyway, the future decides if it ever occurred and has power to reverse it. Now, that's not denying the Holocaust, but what that's saying is that the future has even that power. And that power is what let's say a believer in God or a God would confer upon that God, right? That God has that power to change future events sufficiently radically. So no matter what we believed about the past, we no longer would believe, okay? That's the nature of future experience relative to past experience in principle. Okay, so there's that question. And then, let me see. Oh, question about virtue. Yes. What is a virtuous life? First of all, virtue is actually, it's a social category, okay? What we consider virtues are things that facilitate social cohesion and advancement and integrity and well-being, okay? It's a matter of our relations with others. Philosophy tends ultimately to focus upon rigorous aspects of our circumstances, and it focuses upon each of us individually, ultimately. Okay? And remember, in a philosophical space, all concepts vanish. It's like mystical union with God. It's like you could ask yourself, like in Buddhist nirvana or in mystical union with God or salvation, what virtue? It almost doesn't apply. You've almost passed beyond that, gone beyond, as Nietzsche, the philosopher, wrote, beyond good and evil. Right? But the way that this is, I think, best summarized is by a statement, an aphorism from the Buddhist tradition. Die while alive and be completely dead, then do whatever you will. All is good. Now, die while alive and be completely dead, what are they talking about exactly? They're not talking about becoming a zombie. What they're talking about is the death of concepts. They're talking about the death of assumptions and presumptions that constrain us. They're talking about moving beyond those expectations. They're talking about the death of concepts, and they're talking about that freedom from expectation, freedom from everything that is not rigorous, not certain. And that's the freedom that the Western religious traditions embrace as the truth that will set you free, is philosophic truth, ultimately. Okay, so it looks like we're, I guess, basically out of time for this week. If there are questions from today, I'll address them next time, and I'll address them again like I did today at the end of the session. Next week's talk is going to be about, okay, I see a question about Martin Heidegger. I will address that next time. Actually, I've talked about Martin Heidegger a couple of times in the past, so if you go back to some previous talks, but let me just say, I do not think Martin Heidegger achieved philosophical clarity. And I will talk about that more next time. The comment I made once before was that Martin Heidegger's works are confusing because Martin Heidegger was fundamentally confused. And he was fundamentally confused about the nature of the existentialism that he thought he was embracing. He didn't quite understand it. But that's actually common. I'll give you some examples of other prominent philosophers who are seen as existentialists, but didn't quite fully glean or discern the essence of that existentialism. Okay, but I'll go into that more next time. Okay, so I guess is...
Okay, so to wrap up our philosophical talks, I would like again to show you one comment, again from the same person. Hello, everyone. And also there is a comment from Shymkent City. Hello from Shymkent. So they both joined us today. And also one more comment from our visitor, our guest. Thank you. And we also had 3 thumbs up, which is very great.
Thank you.
So to wrap it up and conclude our philosophical talks, we would like to thank one more time Stephen. Thank you very much for amazing talks. The topic has been excellent, and the next topic is going to be also very interesting as well. Please stay tuned with our social media and our updates. And also thank you everyone for joining us. Hope to see you next week, and Stephen will answer all of your questions in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good week, everyone. I hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good week.